when you talk about nation states, this is a similar question, but are there specific industries or company size that need to worry about the nation state actors coming at them, or is that really anybody?
Yeah, I think today, because so much of interest is in the hands of the private sector in ways that maybe it wasn't before, I think, let's think about it from the defense industrial base perspective. Do the big primes know that foreign intelligence services are going to target them? Absolutely. And they have very robust systems in place to defend against it. But we also know the procurement system has subcontractors and subs and subs and subs of subs. And so, what is an unclassified kind of small piece of a particular technology is made. I think what's growing in the threat space is the ability to hoover up all of that information, aggregate it on the back end, and take all those disparate, unclassified pieces and put that together. I also think companies that possess unique perspectives on society and about a population's relationship with the government are susceptible to those same types of things. So, how would, if you go back to the Cold War times, how would somebody gather information about the sense of the population? It was much more difficult now. Now we have companies that aggregate and have various lenses, views into that, all of which would be interesting to a nation state in terms of intelligence preparation of the environment and then potentially operational preparation.
Yeah, yeah. What we have a question kind of jumping around a little bit here, Matt, jumping to the question of materiality.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have some things that you can provide some points to consider for making that decision?
Yeah, it is. I would describe materiality as a legal concept, which ultimately will require a legal judgment, but there are a lot of inputs. I think, to me, bringing the comptroller, or CFO, the GC, and the CISO CIO all together to have that conversation is the first important piece. If you think about it in a quantitative and a qualitative way, so that is, quantitatively, you're going to have a threshold with regard to your financial books. That piece is pretty well understood. Those direct costs. This incident cost us the following. I think the qualitative assessment, things like impact on competitiveness, reputational costs, vendor relationships, and you kind of go down that stack of all those potential things, is something that companies have to wrestle with. Now, I think there's a drive for some companies to say, well, I'd like to quantify all the qualitative. I think, and to some extent, that there are some possibilities there, but I don't think you can quantify all of it. A lot of it's going to be those qualitative conversations. What does it look like? Are we going to lose these customers? Because remember, the rule says an impact or reasonably likely impact. And so if you can say, hey, yeah, we haven't seen it today, but we are going to feel this quarter, then those are conversations that you need to have. We put out a piece of thought leadership, it's called Considerations Around Materiality. It's on our website. It doesn't give you the answer, but it gives you a lot of questions to wrestle with. And ultimately, what I would encourage is bringing that team together and talk through all of those and how they apply to your company. It's not that it's a new concept, but I think there's a renewed emphasis on it. So now is a good time to sit down and say, well, this is what we mean by materiality. And the GC is going to have a view, the kind of CFO orgs and the CISO are all going to look at that very differently. I think the example I always use is with the CISO organization is most CISOs don't think in terms of materiality. They think in kind of incident response. So if I said, is it a significant incident? They could probably give me an answer. But if I turn to the CFO particularly, or the GC, they think in terms of materiality. And so kind of breaking down those artificial barriers of language and bringing them close together to have a more nuanced conversation is something that regardless of how mature you are today, if you're a public company, you should have those conversations.
Related to that, you talked about the materiality conversation and the aggregate across related incidents.
Mm-hmm.
So, kind of a two-part question. How many clients do you see that can really relate incidents together, that they're that good at gathering the data on an incident? And then I guess part two of that would be, how many times do you see the same actor coming back at the same company?
Yeah, I think you, so first question is not enough. I think there is some maturing across, and look, there's a disparity between sectors. Certain sectors are much better at it than others. But most companies could benefit from some improved threat intelligence. And what I don't mean by that is it's not just indicators. So there's plenty of threat intelligence indicator shops that can push lots of detection content to you. But from a kind of thoughtful way, from a risk perspective, here's who's coming after us. Here's how they act, and let's make some informed risk decisions and investment decisions. And then and so there's a lot of work to be done in that space. In terms of, do we see the same actor coming back? I think in the criminal space, we don't see it a lot. We occasionally see it, but we don't see it a lot. But in the nation state space, I think we do, because they've determined, whatever the company is in their geopolitical interest to understand what that company has. And so, they're going to get, that's your pacing threat with them for detection and eviction, not prevention, meaning you're not going to build a perimeter. They're going to get in. So it is reasonable to detect them, limit their ability to move, and kick them out. But rest assured, they're going to come back because they've already determined it's in their interest to be there.
Yeah. To our viewers, if you've got a question, don't hesitate to put it in Q&A or the chat. We've got time maybe for a couple more. I want to look at the other side of this cybersecurity coin, so to speak, and data ownership as far as the consumer, right? A lot of the data that we're talking about in these incidents might be my data, might be your data. And it seems like the UK leads, maybe, depending on your perspective, in where the responsibility line. Do you see that shifting to companies having to take more and more responsible for our personal data?
Yeah, I think what I see is a trend and a recognition by companies that there are concerns around that data, and it is a matter of trust for that business. And so, you can position yourself as a company to say, hey, we can be trusted with your data. Here's how we protect your data. I think the way, some of the ransomware is a good example of where I see this going. So if you think back a number of years ago, companies were very worried about the reputational damage of being the victim of a ransomware attack. Well, today there's so many ransomware attacks, they're actually less concerned about being the victim and then how they handled the incident and what the public sees as the level of trust in that company, right? So when you see consumers complaining about, hey, my data was lost, but I didn't find out about it for this long, or I don't feel that I really got the information I needed to make good decisions about my data. I think, the best companies are really looking at that from a trust perspective and how to handle that. And so I do think we're moving in that direction, and some of that's driven by consumer sentiment and businesses' view of trust. We even see it from the ransomware actors, the way they're crafting some of their public their disclosures to really kind of push companies to pay the ransom by tying, hey, if the company cared enough about you to pay $1 for your medical information not to be released, and so kind of applying pressure from that perspective. What I'm not sure that we've seen fulsome enough yet is kind of what's that look like from the government perspective. And so I think, you see a lot of, I'll divide it into two pieces. You see a lot of conversations in the regulatory space around it. And I think, but we're not seeing as much action in actual legislation. And so that then bleeds over. Maybe you have more regulation because you have less legislation. And you've seen states, the patchwork of various data disclosure rules and laws around the country developing as well. And so I do think it's a trend, and I think market and consumers are helping shape that, but it remains to be seen where government will go.
Yeah, it's interesting because if I'm sure many of our viewers have fallen victim themselves, right, to having their data exposed, and it seems like all of the work or all of the impact is really on the person, the individual. We've got to do the credit bureaus, and we've got to change passwords, and we've got to do all that. I think we'll start to see some consumer sentiment pushing that. Another question, Matt, is as you were talking about the SEC rules and publicly traded companies, do you see that bleeding over into privately held companies as well, that they're doing some of these things, using that as a guide, even though they may not be required to do it?
Yeah, I've had that conversation with several private companies, and the most mature of those private companies try to mirror what they're seeing from the SEC. And so, yeah, I definitely see the potential pool or drift, however you want to describe it, of this is what the SEC is now requiring. Those increased investments then pull along other non-public companies to do very similar activity, and potentially we'll see some net new advances in terms of cybersecurity.
Yeah. Well, Matt, I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with us today. You have given us a ton of information that we can use. So I want to thank you for carving out the time. One last question for you. You've got an audience of technology leaders from across the country. What's one thing that you want them to take away from this discussion that they can go take action on?
To me, we sometimes fall into the trap that cyber is only a technical problem, and I would argue it's a human endeavor, and it requires a human response. And so don't merely focus on the technical, but focus rather on the relationships and how that interplay takes place, so that you can both translate your technical cyber risk into business risk and exercise all parts of the organization to get achieve the results that you want.
I love that, because sometimes we tend to focus on the technical because that's the easy part. Those human beings can be complicated.
Absolutely.
Well, again, Matt, thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Good to be with you. Take care.